Hey everybody, it's Jeff from Programmer vs. World again. And now we're finally on to part 3 of our podcast tutorial. And pretty much what we're going to do today is I'm going to show you how easy it is actually to build a form and submit new podcast entries to our podcast directory. It's just a way for us to actually have a form where we can actually enter new things rather than having to mess with the nodes. And since our previous 2.5 episode where we moved everything over into Sling 9, we're going to do this completely using Composum in the web interface to do it. So if we open back up our application, we'll see that and open up our content directory, and we'll click on our podcast node here, and we go to this view button. Yours will probably come up like this, and we'll actually come over here to the view button, and we'll click this little open and separate view icon that's here on the end. We can now actually just sit here and refresh this as we make some changes and see what's going on. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to add a selector, which is something new for us. A selector is a way to add something between podcast and HTML, which signifies to Sling that we should use a different renderer. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that if the word add appears between podcast and HTML, then we're going to bring up this HTML form that allows us to enter new podcasts. And each time we submit, we'll actually add one to this podcast list. So in order to get this started, that's going to be annoying. Let me turn that off. All right, so in order to get this started, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our apps directory, and we're going to find where we put our original HTML.html, meaning if it's any of the selector is just HTML. And we're going to add a new file here by clicking on this add button on the bottom of the screen. Now you notice this dialog comes up. This is basically very similar to what comes up in CQ when we actually add a new node. And you'll see as you start to type here, there is like it is pre-populating your list of things that you can add. So in this case, we're actually going to add a file. And you'll notice when we select file, all these other options come up. If anything, by the way, comes up in this thing, you can just click the remove button to remove it. This allows us to upload files, which is really handy, and not have to get all the DS store and bizarre stuff that gets pushed up whenever you actually go to WebDAV. So in our case, we're going to call the node name the name of the file that we want. We want app.html. So we're basically just creating a new HTML file. You can leave these two blank and just say create. You'll notice it puts it right here underneath the folder, and if we click on it, it's going to show blank here. But if we click on it and we go to this text code view section, you'll see that it's just a blank HTML file. You'll notice content is basically the same thing. You can edit either or, but what you're really editing is the content. So let's go ahead and put something in there, and we can do that by clicking on this little edit text button. Looks like a pencil, and when we do, this editor comes up. So let's start by creating just a generic HTML template. You'll notice that when I finished the bracket, the editor did finish it for me. It didn't auto indent, but when I hit return, it did give me a space here. And we want to put our header back in, which I believe was data SOY include. That was located under what? Apps, components, header.html. I hope that works. I think it will. Right? So we're going to put our header in, the standard header that we had before, and we'll put in, let's see, notice that misspell of body. And for right now, since we're using Bootstrap, let's just put in a container div, and right here, no, let's actually create something. Add a new podcast. We'll just create an H1 just like that. We should be able to hit the save button down here. Okay. And after that's saved, we should be able to come right here and put the word add in front of this and actually get ours, but it's not working. We said app. Why did I do that? Well, it's good that we did that. We can actually rename it right now. Okay, so if you select the node itself, why did I put app? It's been one of those mornings, guys. So if you select the node and you come down here, there's a menu of other things you could possibly do. In this case, we're going to select rename, and we're going to say add. I know you guys were probably screaming at the screen right there the whole time. Now if we put add.html, we're going to get an error message that we didn't actually close our quote right there. Now, it's really important. You see that this is actually a pretty nice editor to edit in, but it's not going to give you any warnings that you're about to mess something up. All right, so there we go. So basically our header was included, I can tell, because the font's relatively new and it's bootstrap, and I can see that the container actually indented this section of it, and that's good. Okay, so basically what's happened now is anytime we're in our app and we go to podcast.html, we'll end up coming here. And anytime we insert the add selector in there, we'll end up coming here. This allows us to put a form in here that allows us to edit new podcasts. Now, when we deploy this to production, we're most likely not going to deploy this add code along with it. The reason being is we don't want people logging in and actually being able to add their own podcast. This may be something where we run on like a development server and we get everything set up the way we want, and then we create packages and deploy it to a server that's just serving up content. Now, we could go through a lot of trouble here, and we may still do it. And maybe the next thing I do is we may create a new user and then create it to where only a certain user can create podcasts, and then we've sort of secured it. But the whole time we're using it today, it's assuming that we're logged in as admin, which is why everything's going to miraculously work. So we're going to keep it simple for right now. We're just going to build the form to work. And then if we really need to secure it, and if it's something you guys want to dive into, then basically what we'll end up doing is going to add.html, and we'll add a specific level of security that keeps everyone from being able to read it and only allowing certain users to do it. And that's another way we could actually secure the app. And maybe that's something we should do, but for the most part, for this instruction, just ignore it for right now. So now we have a selector called add. We can continue to build out a completely separate form now, so that we can add a new podcast to our tree. Now we notice here that podcast is pretty much the end of the tree. Actually, let's do it in our new browser. So right here, it's the top level directory that all new things are added underneath. And if I look at the JSON, I can see that 2 was actually created here, 1 was actually created underneath it, yet for some reason, these are actually in order. So what's happened here is, I told you actually backwards the other day when it came to ordered folder. Default Sling folder is always going to move these into some kind of alphanumerical order when it displays them back to you. Especially if you say get children, it's going to bring it back in orderable fashion. If you want to have positive control over the order of this and control what order they are, you have to change this folder type to ordered folder. And then you'll notice that you're able to click and drag and move these things around. Like I should be able to move 1 in front of 2, just like that. And then I can also move 2 back and, whoops, don't want to do that. Move 2 in front of 1, and then now it's going to actually render backwards. Now it's okay from our standpoint to have these go ahead and be in order. So there's no real harm in us leaving this as a Sling folder, in which case it'll always display it in some form of order. In this case, we have managed to jack it up. Well, let's go back then. All right, so whatever. We'll change it back to an ordered folder. Hit save. And then we'll go ahead and put 2 back in front of 1 where it's supposed to, or 1 in front of 2 where it's supposed to be. And we'll leave it that way for now. Anyway, so we want new things to be added to the podcast folder, and it should fall underneath the bottom. But I guess we're going to figure that out as we go along where it's actually going to insert it. So really the only thing we need to do before we start building the form is know where we want to put the new nodes. So we're going to go into add, and we'll go back into this editor and go ahead and drop in a form right here in our container. We'll make the method equal to post. There's nothing wrong with, well, and we don't have to capitalize that, really, we don't. And we want the action to be the name of the path that we want to insert new things under. And there's first trick that you're going to encounter using the Sling Post Servlet happens right here. For instance, we know it's content podcasts. If I leave it like this, though, what's going to happen is it's going to change the node called podcasts. If I want it to add a new one underneath podcasts, just like a directory structure, I would have to put an ending slash there. That ending slash means every time you hit submit, I want you to put a new node underneath there. So in order to get that new node, we need to make sure we fill out a few variables. Let's actually close this and look at what we had to fill out. For each podcast, we needed a JCR title and a JCR description and a resource type. Okay, so these are really simple. So we're going to need all three of these things as well inside our add form. And to do that, we're going to need to create inputs for them. I always try to type there, by the way. What is it? Form group in Bootstrap. And I'm going to copy this a couple times. We know we're going to need at least three things. So inside here, we want to, I'm going to put in a label for, we'll call this podcast name. Input type equal text. Now, the name of that input needs to be verbatim what you want the node property to be stored as. In this case, we're going to say JCR title because that's what we want to get this stored as. We'll say the class is a form control. That's some Bootstrap stuff there. And ID is podcast name. That's just for our label. And just for fun, let's put in a placeholder. All right, and we'll do something like that. Now in here, we're also going to need a place to enter this description. Okay, podcast. We'll call it podcast description. Make a label with the same thing. I like to have that colon there. That's just obnoxiously being OCD. Text area. Class form control, and let's give it 3 rows. And what else do we need? We need a name, JCR description, ID, podcast description. So now we have those things, and we need a submit button in here. Type equal submit. Let's see if I can remember these Bootstrap classes. I know there's button, probably button default, or let's say primary. That makes it blue, right? Submit. But we're still missing a property. If you notice, there's also a Sling resource type that's needed in our listing. Now, we don't want you to be able to enter that because if we did, you could put whatever you want. So what we'll do there to hide it is we'll say input type equal hidden. Name is Sling resource type. And the value is, I think it was components podcast. We can change it later though. That's for rendering an individual podcast. And that should be a pretty good start of a form. Let's save and close. And then we'll refresh and we should get something that looks like that. Yeah, that looks okay. Now there's no harm right now in trying it. Let me pull over my Latin text generator, which is on the other screen. I just want to actually have something to put in the description. Copy that. And we'll just say test podcast. And I'm going to paste in some Latin text. We'll say submit. Now, we'll get this default screen here. This is the Sling Post Servlet. I'm sorry about the chair squeaking all the time. This is the Sling Post Servlet's message back to you that, hey, I created a new node at this specific location. Here's its parent. And this link should actually go to it, to be honest with you. So if you said, go to test.podcast.html, if this was actually real, it would render it. So let's look at the JSON. Whoops, let's tidy that up a little bit. Our title is definitely in there. There's our Latin text, and our resource type did come across. Okay, so it added a node just fine. This was force of habit, by the way. I didn't need to go into any of this because I could have just gone right here and refreshed, and you can see now that test podcast was put in. Because we didn't specify a primary type, it entered it as an ordered folder, and this is what I was telling you earlier, is this is the new default that we're going to have to get used to from this point forward. It's probably okay that it's an ordered folder, to be honest with you. And you'll notice that it added us at the very end of the podcast chain. So if we look, we'll actually be down here. If we want to reorder this, I'm sure we can drag that and then refresh it, and we can put it wherever we want. That's the power of an ordered folder. Not really intuitive for how I get that, but we're going to leave it just like that for now. And that's pretty good. What we need to do next, though, is we need to figure out how to get, once we entered one, we need it to redirect back to the top level of the podcast directory. So let's go ahead and we'll hit the minus. This is a good chance to see how Composum works actually here. We'll select the node and hit minus, and we can actually delete that node back out, go back to podcasts, and we can see that it's actually gone. So let's do some investigation here on how to get a response redirect at the end of that. So we'll just do a search for Sling post Servlet. And if we come here, there's a rather long page here for the Sling post Servlet sitting on Sling's page. And it has everything from multi-part form data posting to a whole bunch of other things. We want to find this tag right here, which is redirect under special parameters. And this redirect instructs the Sling post Servlet to redirect the client at the end of it. Okay, so basically, we need to create a new input type hidden that allows us to redirect to a specific value at the end of that. Well, that's pretty simple enough. So let's just copy one of these and we'll see if it works. We'll go to add.html. We'll go into editor. You'll notice too that when you click on add.html and hit this view button, you're not going to see the whole thing. And that's because you're not rendering the node. You're actually rendering the form itself underneath podcast directly. Okay, so sometimes when you're in here in your apps directory, just ignore that visual that you're going to get. So let's come in here and right underneath this guy. It was called redirect, and we want it to go to content podcasts.html. I'm being really pain in the ass about that. And we'll just hit save on that for now. Save and close. And then we'll refresh this. I should still have some Latin text over here. I do. Let me copy that real fast. Paste it. And we'll go test podcast 2. Hit hit submit, and sure enough, it goes right here to our podcast directory with it automatically added down there at the bottom. That's how easy it is to build a post form. Now, when we get to other things, it's going to seem like possibly editing. What ends up happening is if you change this location to be exactly this node, like podcast 1, content podcast 1, and actually submit it, what happened is it'll edit that node instead of adding a new one. So it's possible now for us to create an edit button and send it to us a new page called edit.html or add.html, where we'll pre-fill our form out and be able to edit it. We'll do that, as well as put a delete button on each one of these for you to be able to delete it. But before we can do any of that, we have to make it so that when we click on an individual podcast, something will actually come up that we can actually see it. So we'll work on that Sightly code next. And what I'll probably do is just create a snippet that you can paste in. We won't go through all this trouble of creating all this on the fly because we've already sort of done that. We did it with the actual podcast's HTML folder right here. We've already kind of done it already. So what I'll do is I'll create a snippet that'll do all this, and then I will we'll just share it on the next podcast, and we'll paste it in really fast and get moving. But that's all you have to do to add something to it. It's basically fill out the individual properties that you want to save, any hidden special properties that you want to save, and just allow the submit to do its thing. Now there is a significant amount of special parameters. If I scroll back to the top here, and type hints as well. If you read this documentation, it's pretty much got every possible combination of real-world examples that you would ever need, including doing file uploads. So it's possible to do an incredible amount of things. Now, even though we're not going to do delete in this episode, delete's a little bit of different animal altogether. Hiding inside Sling is a file called sling.js. Now this is always here, and you can include it anytime you want. I don't even know, do we even get, is the system directory even exposed for us in the tree? It doesn't look like it, does it? It's probably here, it's just probably hidden. Sling, no. There's quite a few libraries that are hidden in here. Maybe I'll find it and I'll look later. Anyway, Sling.js is a JavaScript library that allows you to do some pretty cool things, like actually doing HTTP gets and a few other things, even though these are not nearly as like diverse as maybe Axios or Axiom or any of these other things, including jQuery. But it allows you to also retrieve a JavaScript object off a specific path. But more importantly, it allows you to remove a path if you have that privilege. So we could actually create a button that what it does is uses Sightly to render a function call to remove itself whenever the button's pressed, and as long as you have access to that, it'll actually work. So there's multiple ways to get things done, the Sling post servlet just being the most obvious of how you would get data into it. So now we've pretty much got the structure of something we can build upon, right? So we've got the ability to add podcasts, and then what we'll do is we'll do a snippet to render a podcast, and then we'll add a button to add episodes. And now we basically have a builder. And later we'll create the way to edit, we'll create a way to delete, and the application itself will be taking shape. Then all we really need is to create a servlet or some other way that'll allow us to render XML out of it to form an RSS feed that someone could consume, and we would be done. So for this episode, I'm gonna go ahead and cut it short. This is all we really needed to do, was learn how to basically build a form, create a post action, fill out the properties, and have it be able to add new things to an individual podcast or our podcast listing. So I'm Jeff, and for Programmer vs. World, I'll see you guys in the next one.